An unlikely, though possible, question about A View from the Bridge is the role or the importance of minor characters. And so I'm just going to give a brief video that might explain some of the roles that minor characters take. Generally in the play, the minor characters are there as a device, and they are either there to move the plot along. For example, when you've got the friend Tony who brings Marco and Rodolfo, he brings the plot along, or they're used as a device to highlight the key themes. It's important here to understand some of the background of the play, and I guess there are two socially important things. One is the 1950s idea that homosexuality is wrong and that men should be particularly masculine. It was illegal to be gay at the time, although there was an emerging gay scene and the gay rights movement. So certainly, I mean, Rodolfo isn't homosexual, but certainly longshoremen would have really struggled with the idea of homosexuality, and they would have seen feminine traits in a man as potentially a sign of a homosexual, and that's quite an important backdrop for some of the minor characters. And the other thing that's important is the fact that there was quite a lot of politics that was important at the time. So in the McCarthy era, McCarthy was the president of America. He was quite anti-communist and started to have trials, essentially, where he was trying to get people to name lots of people who were communist, and loads of people were called up to try and name people who were communist, who were deemed to be traitors to America. And Arthur Miller, the playwright, was asked to go and name people, and he refused to testify and refused to name his friends who might have been to communist meetings. And unfortunately, he had quite a few friends who did testify, and Miller really fell out with those people because he thought that they'd betrayed their own friends and their own people. And he had worked with a guy called Kazan, that's his surname, and he'd worked with him on a script called The Hook, which was very much about really the docks. This was quite a lot of time before he wrote A View from the Bridge. And what happened was this guy, Kazan, went off and worked with another guy and wrote a screenplay called On the Waterfront, and that became a famous film, and Marlon Brando played the hero. What was important about that is, in that, it's a really similar story in many respects, set on the docks, talks about immigrants. So really similar story to A View from the Bridge, but the key difference is that on the Waterfront, the hero, Marlon Brando, he tells on the immigrants and he's deemed and hailed to be a hero. However, obviously, in A View from the Bridge, the person who tells is not a hero, and he's betrayed his family, and you see all of the negative things. And I guess that's reflective of the fact that Miller really believed that telling on immigrants, but actually as a metaphor, telling on communists was the wrong thing to do, and it was a betrayal. Whereas Kazan, who he originally worked with and who took that story and put it somewhere else, and who did testify and name communists, name their friends, that he thought that was bad. And it's a distinct response to the film On the Waterfront. And that's quite an important bit of context, because when we meet some of these characters, we see two bits of context that are important. So firstly, I'm going to talk about Mike. Mike's a longshoreman and a friend of Eddie's, and he hangs out with Mike and Louie outside of Eddie's house. And a nice quote from him is that they're talking about Marco, and then he suddenly, grinning, says, "That blonde one, though." And then Eddie looks at him, and then he says, "He's got a sense of humour." Now, he's suddenly talking about Rodolfo. He wants to raise Rodolfo because he thinks that Rodolfo's feminine and he thinks that he's odd. Again, he highlights the fact that he's blonde, which Eddie has already referred to as potentially not being real blonde hair and therefore potentially being a sign of his homosexuality. What's interesting is that Mike clearly thinks it's funny because he's grinning, and he wants to raise it. He wants to talk about it because he thinks it's an amusing topic. And he says, "That blonde one, though." But when Eddie looks at him, there's a dash there, and that represents a pause, almost like Mike sees that it's a warning from Eddie, that it's a touchy point for him, and he doesn't want him to openly address the problems with Rodolfo. So he rethinks and he says, oh, he's got a sense of humour, and suddenly makes it about how funny Rodolfo is and how amusing he is, rather than actually addressing what quite a lot of them are fearing, because they're longshoremen, because they believe masculinity to be so important. What they're all fearing is that he's a homosexual. And then we've got Louie, who again is the friend of Eddie and hangs out with Mike outside of Eddie's home. And he brings out a nice theme towards the end when he is utterly disgusted by what Eddie has done. He's broken the Omerta Code between brothers and basically rung immigration. And towards the end of the play, he stood on stage, he watches immigration come and take away all of the immigrants from the house, and Eddie shouts after him, Louie, Louie, and Louie barely turns, and then he walks off and he walks stage right with Mike, and they leave. Now, that's particularly symbolic of the way that Arthur Miller felt about people who had betrayed the communists, and obviously Miller's own parents were also immigrants. And essentially he was showing that if you betray your own friends and your own family, then you cannot expect people to stand by you because, I guess as Catherine would say, you are a rat. And that's definitely symbolic of the way that Arthur Miller dealt with his friendships and relationships post the McCarthy era and all of the people who testified against the communists. Then we've got Tony. And Tony's a friend of the Carbones, and he is the guy who helps Marco and Rodolfo off the ship. He's less interesting, really, because he's a very small part, and he's not used as a device to highlight a theme. He's simply used as a device to move the plot along, and he says to them, you're on your own now, just be careful, that's all. There's very little to say about him, other than that he represents one of the workers who will facilitate immigration to America. We've then got the first immigration officer. He's one of two officers at the Immigration Bureau who come and they look for Marco and Rodolfo upon Eddie's request. Now, there are a couple of things that are interesting here. One of the things he says that really gets under my skin, he's addressing Catherine. He says, look, girly. And there's something really brilliantly patronising about calling her girly. And I guess that's indicative of the role of the woman in the 1950s, particularly the younger woman. He is patronising towards her. He feels that she has no power and that she should pipe down and stop trying to tackle him. He's got this kind of unquestioned sense of authority. And I guess that that was true, certainly of immigration officers and to a degree the police. There was a sense of authority and slight fear in places like Red Hook because so many of them were immigrants and because there was a certain amount of crime there. He also says if you want to get yourself a lawyer, although I'm telling you now you're wasting your money. And that's important because there's this sense that justice has already been done. It wouldn't matter what story any of them had, that these guys, without a trial, are guilty of being illegal immigrants and that they needed to go home immediately. And there seems to be a slight sense of injustice there. And again, I think that's probably representative of the communist era, whereby people were named as being communist and they were just deemed to be guilty regardless of whether or not there was actually any real proof of their guilt. And at this point, you see that there's very little proof that Rodolfo and Marco are immigrants, or illegally anyway. But they are told that they are going to be sent home and that it's pointless getting a lawyer. Then we've got the second immigration officer. He again has this real sense of status and power, and there's this lovely quote where it says, the second officer sweeps past and glancing about goes into the kitchen. This just represents his absolute ability to control the situation. He sweeps past, there's something really casual about that and powerful, and he's looking around, he's really suspicious, and he just goes straight into the heart of their house, which is the kitchen, without invite, without permission, without asking. And again, this just shows the all-encompassing power they have, and I guess again that's symbolic of the McCarthy era and the fact that the government could just do that. They could just come in, pick you up and take you away and root around through your home and through your life, and just you would have no power. Then we've got a different character, Mr. Lipari. Excuse my terrible Italian, Lipari. He's the butcher who lives upstairs from Eddie. And he again is used to emphasise the damage that can be done, and when you tell on the people around you. His nephew gets taken away, and there's a nice stage direction that says Lipari the butcher turns and starts up left with his arm around his wife. So again, he's so disgusted by what Eddie has done and so hurt by it that he just walks away. It's almost like Eddie does not exist to him anymore because he's such a traitor. And we get this sense that Lipari is actually a good man because he's protecting his wife. It's been so damaging for them that he has to protect her with his arm around her. He's a loving guy, and that makes the betrayal even worse. And it's further made worse by the description that we have of Mrs. Lipari, who is described by Eddie himself as an old lady on the top floor, and then she's got an empty room. And basically, she's got an empty room. She's been kind enough to offer it to Rodolfo and Marco, and the reward for her kindness is that Eddie's called immigration, and then meant that her nephew has to go home. And there's something, the juxtapose between the vulnerability of an old lady and the strength and the sweeping power of the immigration officers is really quite painful to watch. And that makes further emphasises how bad what Eddie's done is. And then you've got the two submarines. Now, I don't even think they say anything, but they're the people that essentially are upstairs at the Liparis, and they only came in yesterday, and when immigration come, they get taken away. And they're described, it says, it's Lipari, Beatrice says this, Lipari the butcher, his nephew, and they come from Bari, they just got here yesterday. Now, there's a few things that are important there. One, the fact that it's a nephew implies that he's slightly younger. And again, that offers a sense of vulnerability and makes you feel sorry for the fact that he's going to be deported immediately. And again, the fact that his nephew shows that it's family. So Eddie, by attacking Marco and Rodolfo in the way he has, by calling immigration, has pulled apart a whole family, not just his own, but somebody else's. And then we get this extra bit of information, which is quite a clever device, really, from Miller. They come from Bari. And they only got here yesterday. He, in those three short sentences, nephew, where they come from, and the fact they only came yesterday, manages to create a real sense of sympathy for that submarine. It's tragic that they've worked so hard to get here through desperation, and then after one day, because of Eddie's actions, they get sent home again. And then the final character that I would want to talk about, who actually doesn't even appear in it, but we just hear about him, will be Vinnie Balzano. Obviously, he's like, his story is foreshadowing what will happen later on with Eddie. He's kind of like a precursor to what actually happens, and he's the boy who betrayed his family, called immigration on his own uncle, which is exactly the same as what Eddie does. It's so ingrained in Eddie's moral code that that's wrong at the start of the play, but his moral code's not what guides him towards the end. It's his bitter love for Catherine and his need to get Rodolfo away, and so he sort of betrays his own moral code. But when Eddie talks about Vinnie and about where Vinnie is, he says, "You'll never see him no more," a guide or a thing like that. And I guess that's quite important because he says you'll never see him no more because Vinnie's had to go away. But what's nice is that Mrs. Lipari, Mr. Lipari, Mike and Louie, they don't see Eddie no more. He calls after them, he pleads with them, and they don't even respond because they don't see him anymore because he's no longer deemed to be a man that's worthy of looking at anymore because he's a rat, as Catherine said. So that's pretty much the role of those characters. And if you talk about them in the wider social context and Miller's views, particularly, I guess, on women, certainly on feminine men and homosexuality, and definitely on communism, you can get yourself quite a nice little mark as long as you make sure that you do a bit of analysis of language in there too.